We are the king and queen who founded Hyrule, after all. Or at least we were the last time I checked.
Check yourself before you wreck yourself.
Tears of the Kingdom has been out for 2 months now, but there's already a fierce debate about where it takes place in the Legend of Zelda timeline, specifically the past events we see through the memories of Zelda. The biggest point of contention is Rauru saying he is the first king of Hyrule Kingdom. This would imply the past of the game is after Skyward Sword but before Minish Cap. But a lot of people think the Switch games are Nintendo's attempt to just reboot the series and forget the timeline nonsense altogether. Zelda fans have been arguing about the timeline for years now, and Breath of the Wild only added more problems with the idea of just rebooting everything and starting over. I'm joined by Wiz Catches Lightning to show how you can reboot the series and still acknowledge every other Legend of Zelda game you've ever played. That's why we are challenging when Tears of the Kingdom's past takes place. We're assuming the least while not compromising the most. Wiz and I both believe that the history of Tears of the Kingdom happens after a merging of timelines has already occurred long after the events of every other Zelda game, but before Breath of the Wild. So our collective theory operates under this assumption.
Hey Max Volume, thanks for having me. The problem is, with Rauru's statement, there's more evidence to prove that he's incorrect by only considering that his kingdom is the first Hyrule Kingdom. I don't think Rauru is considering that his kingdom is just the latest version in the land of Hyrule. If you saw our other video, Rauru's kingdom would be like Hyrule Kingdom 7.0 at this point. It's the latest iteration of a kingdom that follows a cycle of prosperity and decline.
Providing canon evidence and logic, Rauru's Hyrule Kingdom should have started after the timeline's fusion danced back into one, which we will explain in these respective videos. Before we begin, we have to define our theory. If you've played Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, there is an overwhelming amount of evidence to suggest the split timelines merge back into one. We see locations named after places and people from each timeline. We have gear from ancient heroes seen in each timeline. And during the champion ceremony in Zelda's Memories in Breath of the Wild, in English and Japanese, Zelda and her champions reference events from all three timelines. There can't be a fourth timeline that splits before or during Ocarina of Time, where Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom might take place, because the people, places, and things referenced would not exist in this separate timeline. The past leads to the future, and this fourth timeline would not have a past that leads to all the events we see during these three split timelines. But if the timelines merged, then this single fixed timeline would have three pasts where the original events Breath of the Wild references happened.
We also know that the history of Tears of the Kingdom runs along a central, unchanging timeline, as Zelda receives the Master Sword after quite a bit of time has passed, and only after Ganondorf has been sealed by Rauru. This establishes, again, that time would have to flow along a single, unchanging thread, albeit a complex thread.
So what causes this merger? We have no idea. All we have are theories, but what we can say with a very high probability based on the evidence is that there is a timeline convergence. It is sometime after this correction of reality that we will argue the past of Tears of the Kingdom takes place, while also showing you why it doesn't work if it's right after Skyward Sword. The ancient Rito Wind Sage is the most obvious piece of evidence to contradict the past of Tears of the Kingdom being next after Skyward Sword. This is because in canon lore, the Rito did not come into existence until after the Great Sea floods Hyrule Kingdom, before the events of Wind Waker. The Zora were unable to survive in the waters of the Great Sea, but had a forced evolution through the intervention of the guardian deity Valu. Now, you could say, well, there could be other origins of the Rito. Sure, it's a possibility, but as of right now, we only have one canon origin. But what about the murals in Twilight Princess, the ones in Castletown depicting the Rito? Well, those murals were not in the original Twilight Princess on GameCube, but were added to the HD remaster on Wii U. Personally, I think they were just Easter eggs leading up to Breath of the Wild, since they released within a year of each other.
I mean, the artist who made that mural admitted that it was made from artistic whim, so that definitely checks out. That dude took his poetic license and ran with it.
But let's pretend, for the sake of argument, that the Rito exist in the child timeline. We have to remember that these three split timelines share the same past before Ocarina of Time. If we look at the sequence of the adult timeline, the Rito only developed after Ocarina of Time, meaning there were no Rito before or during that game. Because all three split timelines share the same past before Ocarina, that would mean that even if the Rito existed in all three timelines, they would have had to have evolved afterwards, because the adult timeline shows us the Rito did not exist until after Ocarina, with their first appearance being a forced evolution due to the events described in the prologue of Wind Waker.
We can see with this chart from page 363 of Creating a Champion that the Rito history is not as old as the histories of all of the other races of Hyrule. This would follow the idea that the Rito did not evolve until later on in the timeline, as the Canaan lore tells us. Now, if you also look at this historical chart, you can see that the Gorons don't have a history either. However, we can observe that there are physical Gorons in Skyward Sword. We have to take the physical evidence of the Gorons being in Skyward Sword as primary evidence here to explain why they exist, but the Rito do not exist until just before the events of Wind Waker. As far as the Gorons not having any history are concerned, well, this would be considered a moot point because of the way their society is structured. The Gorons were not historians. They passed on stories and immortalized their heroes in stone. The Gorons are one of the oldest races in Hyrule, and their existence suggests that they're basically anthropomorphic rocks. Their only history entry leading up to 100 years before Breath of the Wild is that they are ruled by a chief, so they don't pay too much mind to history outside of oral tradition and stone monuments. The Zora, like Max Volume said, are the ancestors of the Rito, which happened into existence just before Wind Waker. The Zora are also not found in Skyward Sword. If we look at this chart on page 55 of the Zelda Encyclopedia, we can see that the Zora don't appear until after the events of Minish Cap, with their first chronological appearance being in Ocarina of Time. Looking at the historical chart for the Zora, we only begin to see an actual history of them with the advent of Princess Ruda, the Sage of Water. We do have a likely answer for why this is, with the existence of the Pirella, who were water-dependent creatures. It's our belief that the Pirella would have been the common ancestor to their Zora descendants. This is why we only see the Pirella in Skyward Sword, and no other Zelda game beyond Skyward Sword. This evidence suggests that there wouldn't be Zora around if Tears of the Kingdom's past took place before Minish Cap. With all of this information, we can logically conclude that the Rito Wind Sage seen in Tears of the Kingdom would be an impossible placement directly after Skyward Sword, because there's enough evidence proving that the Rito did not exist during a time before Minish Cap.
Let's take a look at all the Sage's elements in Tears of the Kingdom. In the past, we have Sages for Wind, Lightning, Fire, Water, Spirit, Light, and Time. If you assume this past is after Skyward Sword, you actually have contradictions with what the series presents. In Skyward Sword, you can find images of the 6 Sage Medallions we see in Ocarina of Time. At the entrance to the goddess statue, if you look up, you will see half of a mural depicting part of the Triforce and the 3 Sage Medallions for Light, Forest, and Spirit. Outside the sealed temple, if you look at the ceiling, you will see the other half of the same mural, showing part of the Triforce and the last 3 Sage Medallions of Water, Fire, and Shadow. Skyward Sword shows us the elements the future sages in Ocarina will be associated with. In Ocarina of Time, when Link first awakens in the Chamber of Sages, Rauru tells us that he and the ancient sages built the Temple of Time to seal the Sacred Realm and the Triforce. The construction occurs in the era between Skyward Sword and Ocarina of Time. Since we know what the elements are in Ocarina, and we know what the elements are in Skyward Sword, you can conclude that these ancient sages would have been associated with the same 6 elements. This is where the contradiction comes in. If the past of Tears of the Kingdom takes place after Skyward Sword, then the sages must represent the same 6 elements we see in Skyward Sword and Ocarina. But we don't see all of these elements. The sages of the past in Tears have no Sage of Shadow, and between Skyward Sword and Ocarina of Time, there are no Wind or Lightning sages. Why would the sages and their elements change after Skyward Sword, but then change back for Ocarina of Time? Doesn't really make a lot of sense, does it? unless the Sages of Tears come later in the timeline, say after a timeline merge, when the elements have changed over so much time passing. We can actually see a changing of the forest and wind elements throughout the series. Usually when we have a game with sages, there are temples that correspond to each associated element. In Skyward Sword, we have two temples, the Skyview Temple and the Earth Temple. These temples are not meant for sages because at this point in the series, there are no sages yet, but instead, these temples protect the springs Zelda must visit during her pilgrimage. The Earth Temple, although referred to as such, represents more of a fire temple, as the entire complex is filled with lava and is home to Eldin, the Dragon of Fire. The Skyview Temple fits more with a forest motif. The interior is full of plants, tree roots, branches, and there's even leaf murals. But also, if you look at the map in-game, it's actually referred to as the Forest Temple. Minish Cap has no sages and only one temple, the Temple of Droplets. The game does feature the Wind Palace and the Fortress of Winds, but they are not temples and not meant for sages. It does feature the element of wind, but it's not an element for a sage at this point in time. Ocarina is pretty straightforward. In the Lost Woods, you will eventually find yourself in the Forest Temple, where you awaken Saria, the Sage of Forest. I will point out that during development of the game, it was supposed to be the element of wind, but in the final game, it's the element of forest. So we have to accept that as canon, despite the development history. In Wind Waker, we see no forest temple. There's a Forbidden Woods dungeon, but it's not a temple and it's not meant for a sage either. Instead, we see temples for wind and earth.
No! God, please, no!
The Sage of Wind is Makar, the Korok. Notice how a forest creature is the Sage of Wind. Spirit Tracks does have a forest temple and a forest sage as shown by the Locomo, but the story also takes place in New Hyrule. The sages we see in Twilight Princess all represent the same 6 elements we see in Ocarina of Time. There's also a forest temple, which has a large emphasis on wind mechanics. Again, notice this connection between forest and wind. And the most important point, the present day of Tears of the Kingdom has a Sage of Wind and a wind temple. There is no forest sage or element. If you remember how in Wind Waker the Sage of Wind is a Korok, and in Twilight Princess the Forest Temple has an emphasis on wind, it's very plausible that over time the forest element actually became the wind element, because we only see wind sages and temples after Ocarina of Time. This means having a wind sage before Ocarina doesn't line up with the evidence we see in the series. But it would make sense if the past of Tears of the Kingdom was after a timeline merge, because by this point in time, the evidence suggests that the forest element has become the wind element.
Additionally, the Sage of Spirit in Ocarina is Naboru, whereas the Sage of Spirit in Tears of the Kingdom is Minoru. In Tears of the Kingdom's past, the Gerudo Sage is the Sage of Lightning, an element that doesn't exist in Ocarina of Time. If we follow Max Volume's evidence of elements remaining consistent throughout the Zelda franchise, it doesn't make sense for elemental sages like the Sages of Wind and Lightning to appear before Minish Cap, only to disappear entirely in Ocarina. The Gerudo traits follow a similar pattern of consistency, if and only if we place Tears of the Kingdom's past just before Breath of the Wild. Here are the Gerudo in Ocarina of Time. Notice how they have topaz eyes and round ears. Ganondorf also has topaz eyes and round ears. The same can be said for Naboru as well as Kome and Kotake, the twin sisters who raised Ganondorf. Here are the Gerudo from the past in Tears of the Kingdom. They have green eyes and pointed ears. If you can't see their eyes very well, here's what the ancient Gerudo sage looks like under her mask. She has green eyes and pointed ears. Ganondorf, on the other hand, has round ears and topaz eyes, just like the Ganondorf in Ocarina. Why is this important? Well, in page 401 of Creating a Champion, it says that long ago, the ancient Gerudo had rounded ears. Over time, their ears became pointed, and their eyes turned from topaz to green. We are given 2 possible explanations for this. The first is that it's a result of generations of intermingling with Hylian men. The second is that because Ganondorf came from their tribe, they felt great shame and began to listen for messages from the goddesses. Just as the Hylians are said to have pointed ears to hear the gods, so too did the Gerudo have this capability after generations of intermingling with Hylian Vo.
If the past of Tears of the Kingdom is after Skyward Sword, then that means the Gerudo's physical traits change between then and Ocarina, but then change back to how they originally were sometime before Breath of the Wild? Quite frankly, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would their physical traits change and then change back over time? Also, if the Gerudo originally had green eyes and pointed ears, which contradicts creating a champion, then why is Tears Ganondorf the only Gerudo with round ears and topaz eyes?
To say that the Gerudo ears and eyes changed from round ears and topaz eyes to pointed ears and green eyes implies a progressive evolution. That's what our theory implies when we place the history of Tears of the Kingdom before Breath of the Wild in the timeline. But if we place Tears of the Kingdom's past before Minish Cap, we are implying that the evolution of the Gerudo goes from green eyes and pointed ears to topaz eyes and round ears, only to later go back to green eyes and pointed ears. So that's an evolution and then a regression followed by the same exact evolution. And that doesn't make as much sense. The Ganondorf we see in Tears has round ears and topaz eyes, just like the Ganondorf in Ocarina of Time before he obtained his Triforce of Power. I initially attributed this to a sex-linked recessive trait. Now, I don't have a degree in biology.
You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
But I can tell you right now that I don't need a degree in biology to understand that it only takes one sex-linked recessive trait, that being eye color or ear shape, to pass from a mother to her son's X chromosome in order for that trait to express itself. And when we pair this with the fact that only one Gerudo male can be born every century, this doesn't leave much room for genetic variation for those Gerudo males. Scientifically speaking, that's how Ganondorf would retain the traits of the Gerudo from Ocarina of Time. We can also explain that he would retain these traits because he is a reincarnation of Ganondorf Dragmire, who would have come before him. The logic here is that Ocarina Ganondorf came first, which creating a champion actually says. All of the Gerudo at this time had topaz eyes and round ears, even Ganondorf, and this is why his eyes and ears are like this. Fast forward to after the timeline merge, and the Gerudo have pointed ears over time and their eye color has changed. But because each Ganondorf is a reincarnation, this is why the Ganondorf we see in Tears of the Kingdom still has the features of the Ocarina of Time Gerudo, because he's retained the traits of the first Ganondorf.
Wait. Pause for a sec. Okay. Rewind. Right there. Perfect. What do you see right there?
We see some Molduga?
We see Molduga.
Okay. Other than trying to dramatically reenact a conversation we had about 48 hours ago, what are you trying to say here?
Which Zelda games do we see Molduga in?
We see them in the original Zelda.
Those are Moldorms, Wiz.
Well, we see Molduga in A Link to the Past.
Nope, those are Land Mola. Try again.
We see them in Majora's Mask?
Twin Mold.
Well, we definitely see them in Skyward Sword.
Molder Rock!
Holy Hylia, you're right. Where in the heck do we see Molduga?
Well, we only see them in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, which includes Tears of the Kingdom's past. If we're assuming the past takes place after Skyward Sword, then that means Moldugas exist pretty much during the entire timeline in Gerudo Desert, so why don't we see them in the other games? In Ocarina, Twilight Princess, and Four Swords Adventures, we go to the Gerudo Desert, but curiously, we don't see any Moldugas. They exist exclusively in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Doesn't that sound weird? If the past of Tears of the Kingdom was after a timeline merge, that would explain why we only see them in those two games, because they only exist in the period of time after the merging. Just because we don't see them doesn't mean they don't exist, sure, but it's still strange that there's no mention of them at all earlier in the timeline. Just like it's strange how in every Legend of Zelda that takes place in Hyrule, we usually see a different landscape when compared to the other games. Each game for the most part has its own version of geography for Hyrule. From a game design perspective, it's just to keep things fresh, as it would be boring if every game had the exact same map. In universe though, you could say the maps are different because there's so much time between games that the geography just naturally shifts and changes. We see in Zelda's memories that the ancient Hyrule looks pretty similar to the present day Hyrule. We see the Great Plateau and the dueling peaks before it's split. We also see the cliff outside the Shrine of Resurrection, and that's where we have a problem. If the past of Tears of the Kingdom is after Skyward Sword, then that would mean that the geography changes in every game after. But then when we get to Breath of the Wild, the geography is back to how it was in the past of Tears of the Kingdom. How can you explain the map having such significant changes between games, but then mysteriously changing back to how it was at the start of the timeline? The answer is, you don't. It doesn't make sense for the geography to change that drastically, but then change back over tens of thousands of years. But if the past of Tears of the Kingdom took place after the timeline merge, there's no games in between that have a different map. So logically, it makes sense why the geography we see in the past of Tears is similar to that of the present day. In conclusion, the past of Tears of the Kingdom cannot be after Skyward Sword because of all the reasons presented in this video, as well as the video we made over on Wiz's channel. Therefore, Rauru's kingdom could not have been the first kingdom. His kingdom had to have been founded after a cycle of prosperity and decline, which we will cover in more depth in Wiz's video, so definitely go check that out. If you agree, disagree, or have your own thoughts, let us know below in the comments, and thanks for watching.